drop. It was like the rapid heartbeat of something dying. And so the elevator took us into the world of Down Under, and we locked it off. There we were, in a 5-mile layered city designed not only as a massive office and laboratory, but as an impenetrable shelter. It was our special reward for creating the poisons of war. There was food, water, medical supplies, films, books, you name it, enough to last 2,000 people for 100 years. Of the 2,000 it was designed for, perhaps 1,100 made it. The others didn't run fast enough from the parking lot, or the other buildings, or they were late for work, or maybe they'd called in sick. Perhaps they were the lucky ones. They might have died in their sleep, or while they were having a morning quickie with a spouse, or perhaps as they lingered over the last cup of coffee. Because you see, Mr. Journal, Down Under was no paradise. Before long, suicides were epidemic. I considered it myself from time to time. People slashed their throats, drank acid, took pills. It was not unusual to come out of your cubicle in the morning and find people dangling from pipes and rafters like ripe fruit. There were also the murders. Most of them performed by a crazed group who lived in the deeper recesses of the unit and called themselves the shit-faces. From time to time they smeared dung on themselves and ran amok, clubbing men, women, and children born down under to death. It was rumored they ate human flesh. We had a police force of sorts, but it didn't do much. It didn't have much sense of authority. Worse, we all viewed ourselves as deserving victims. Except for Mary, we'd all helped to blow up the world. Mary came to hate me. She came to the conclusion that I had killed Ray. It was a realization that grew in her like a drip, growing and growing, until it became a gushing flood of hate. She seldom talked to me. She tacked up a picture of Ray and looked at it most of the time. Topside, she'd been an artist, and she took that up again. She rigged a kit of tools and inks and became a tattooist. Everyone came to her for a mark. And though each was different, they all seemed to indicate one thing. I fucked up. I blew up the world. Brand me. Day in and day out, she did her tattoos, having less and less to do with me, pushing herself more and more into this work until she was as skilled with skin and needles as she had been topside with brush and canvas. And one night, as we lay on our separate pallets, feigning sleep, she said to me, "I just want you to know how much I hate you." I know, I said. "You killed Ray." "I know." "You say you killed her, you bastard. Say it." "I killed her," I said, and meant it. Next day I asked for my tattoo. I told her this dream that came to me nightly. There would be darkness, and out of this darkness would come a swirl of glowing clouds, and the clouds would melt into a mushroom shape, and out of that, torpedo-shaped, nose pointing skyward, and striding on ridiculous cartoon legs, would step the bomb. There was a face painted on the bomb, and it was my face. And suddenly the dream's point of view would change, and I would be looking out of the eyes of that painted face. Before me was my daughter, naked, lying on the ground, her legs wide apart, her sex glazed like a wet canyon, and I, the bomb, would dive into her, pulling those silly feet after me, and she would scream. I could hear it echo as I plunged through her belly, finally driving myself out of the top of her head, then blowing to terminal orgasm. And the dream would end where it began. A mushroom cloud. Darkness. When I told Mary the dream and asked her to interpret it in her art, she said, "Bury your back." And that's how the design began. An inch of work at a time, a painful inch. she made sure of that. Never once did I complain. She'd send the needles home as hard and deep as she could. And though I might moan and cry out, I never asked her to stop. I could feel those fine hands touching my back, and I loved it. The needles, the hands, the needles, the hands. And if that was so much fun, you ask, why did you come topside? You ask such probing questions, Mr. Journal. Really you do. And I'm glad you asked that. My telling will be like a laxative, I hope. Maybe if I just let the ship flow, I'll wake up tomorrow and feel a lot better about myself. Sure. And it'll be the dawning of a new Pepsi generation as well. It will all have been a bad dream. The alarm clock will ring. I'll get up, have my bowl of Rice Krispies, and tie my tie. Okay, Mr. Journal, the answer. 20 years or so after we went down under, a fistful of us decided it couldn't be any worse topside than it was below. We made plans to go see. Simple as that. Mary and I even talked a little. We both entertained the crazed belief that Ray may have survived. She'd be 38. We might have been hiding below like vermin for no reason. It could be a brave new world up there. I remember thinking these things, Mr. Journal, and half believing them. We outfitted two 60-foot crafts that were used as part of our transportation system down under. Plugged in the half-remembered codes that opened the elevators and drove the vehicles inside. The elevator lasers cut through the debris above them, and before long we were topside. The doors opened to sunlight, muted to gray-green clouds, and a desert-like landscape. Immediately I knew there was no brave new world over the horizon. It had all gone to hell in a fiery handbasket, and all that was left of man's millions of years of development were a few pathetic humans living down under like worms, and a few others crawling topside like the same. We cruised about a week and finally came to what had once been the Pacific Ocean. Only there wasn't any water now, just that cracked blackness. We drove along the shore for another week and finally saw life. A whale. Jacobs immediately got the idea to shoot one and taste its meat. Using a high-power rifle, he killed it. And he and 7 others cut slabs off of it, brought the meat back to cook. They invited us all to eat, but the meat looked greenish, and there wasn't much blood, and we warned them against it. But Jacobs and the others ate it anyway. As Jacobs said, it's something to do. A little later on, Jacob threw up blood as intestines boiled out of his mouth. And not long after, those who had shared the meat had the same thing happen to them. They died crawling on their bellies like gutted dogs. There wasn't a thing we could do for them. We couldn't even bury them. The ground was too hard. We stacked them like cordwood along the shoreline and moved camp down a way. Tried to remember how remorse felt. And that night, while we slept as best we could, the roses came. Now let me admit, Mr. Journal, I do not actually know how the roses survived. But I have an idea. And since you've agreed to hear my story, and even if you haven't, you're going to anyway, I'm going to put logic and fantasy together and hope to arrive at the truth. These roses lived in the ocean bed, underground, and at night, they came out. Up until then, they'd survived as parasites of reptiles and animals. But a new food had arrived from down under. Humans. Their creators, actually. Looking at it that way, you might say we were the gods who conceived them. And their partaking of our flesh and blood was but a new version of wine and water. I can imagine the pulsating brains pushing up to the sea bottom on thick stalks, extending feathery feelers and tasting the air out there beneath the light of the moon, which, through those odd clouds, gave the impression of a pus-filled boil. And I can imagine them uprooting and dragging their vines across the ground towards the shore where the corpses lay. Thick vines sprouted little thorny vines, and these moved up the bank and touched the corpses. Then, with a lashing motion, the thorns tore into the flesh, and the vines, like snakes, slithered through the wounds and inside. Secreting a dissolving fluid that turned the innards to the consistency of watery oatmeal, they slurped up the mess, and the vines grew and grew at amazing speed, moved and coiled through the bodies, replacing nerves and shaping into the symmetry of the muscles that they had devoured. Lastly, they pushed up through the necks, into the skulls, ate tongues and eyeballs, and sucked up the mouse-gray brains like soggy gruel. With an explosion of skull shrapnel, the roses bloomed, their tooth-hard petals expanding into beautiful red and yellow flowers, hunks of human heads dangling from them like shattered watermelon rinds. In the center of these blooms, a fresh, black brain pulsed, and feathery feelers once again tasted air for food and breeding grounds. Energy waves from the floral brain shot through the miles and miles of vines that were knotted inside the bodies, and as they replaced nerves, muscles, and vital organs, they made the bodies stand. Then those corpses turned their flowered heads towards the tents where we slept, and the blooming corpses... Another little scientist joke there if you're into the English idiom, Mr. Journal. Walked, eager to add the rest of us to their animated bouquet. I saw my first rosehead while I was taking a leak. I had left the tent and gone down by the shoreline to relieve myself, and when I caught sight of it out of the corner of my eye, because of the bloom, I first thought it was Susan Dyer's. She wore a thick, woolly afro that surrounded her head like a lion's mane, and the shape of the thing struck me as a silhouette. But when I zipped and turned it, it wasn't an afro. It was a flower blooming out of Jacob's. I recognized him by his clothes and the hunk of his face that hung off of one of the petals like a worn-out hat on a peg. In the center of the blood-red flower was a pulsating sac, and all around it little wormy things squirmed. Directly below the brain was a thin proboscis. It extended towards me like an erect penis. At its tip, just inside the opening, were a number of large thorns. A sound like a moan came out of that proboscis, and I stumbled back. Jacob's body quivered briefly, as if he had been besieged by a sudden chill, and ripping through his flesh and clothes from neck to foot was a mass of thorny, wagging vines that shot out to 5 feet in length. With an almost invisible motion, they waved from west to east, slashed my clothes, tore my hide, knocked my feet out from beneath me. It was like being hit by a cat of nine tails. Dazed, I rolled onto my hands and knees, bare walked away from it. The vines whipped against my back and butt, cut deep. Every time I got to my feet, they tripped me. The thorns not only cut, they burned like hot ice picks. I finally twisted away from a net of vines, slammed through one last chute, and made a break for it. Without realizing it, I was running back to the tent. My body felt as I had been lying on a bed of nails and razor blades. My forearm heard something terrible. I had used it to lash the thorns away from me. I glanced down as I ran. It was covered in blood. A strand of vine about 2 feet in length was coiled around it like a garter snake. A thorn had torn a deep wound in my arm, and the vine was sliding an end into the wound. Screaming, I held my forearm in front of me like I just discovered it. The flesh, where the vine had entered, rippled and made a bulge that looked like a junkie's favorite vein. The pain was nauseating. I snatched at the vine, ripped